Good evening and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Christopher Scalia, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the first installment of an exciting new project from AEI, the American Dream Lecture Series. As part of AEI's American Dream Initiative, the American Dream Lecture Series seeks to revitalize our nation's core institutions by inviting prominent writers, academics, and thinkers to address some of the most significant cultural and social challenges facing the United States. As we approach the 250th anniversary of America's founding, these lectures are an opportunity to ask, what is the health of our national institutions and foundational principles? What threats do they face, and what prospects for reform are available? In the broad variety and high quality of its featured speakers, the American Dream Lecture Series will also carry on the tradition of AEI's Bradley Lecture Series, which for decades enriched policy conversations with high-profile lectures about the state of American politics and culture. If you look on the tables in front of you, we have flyers that list some of the esteemed guests and topics that we have planned in the months ahead. It's hard to think of a better speaker to kick off this new series than Yuval Levin, one of America's most important political thinkers. He is the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy, as well as Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies here at AEI, and Editor-in-Chief of National Affairs. He's also the author of several books, and his next will be published in the spring of 2024 by Basic Books. Titled Charter of Unity, it is the basis for his remarks this evening. One reason Yuval's work is so valuable is that it provides thoughtful, dispassionate solutions to the problems besetting our national institutions. His remarks this evening are no exception, as he'll help us understand how even in these exceptionally polarized days when our constitutional order seems broken, the United States Constitution can still help us form a more perfect union by fostering cohesion and finding common ground. After his remarks, Yuval will join me for a follow-up conversation in those comfortable chairs there, and then we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Yuval Levin for his remarks on the Constitution and national unity.
Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and thank you, Chris. I appreciate that, and I appreciate very much your taking the lead and launching this series, focused, as you say, on various facets of the American dream. AEI, as Chris mentions, has a tradition of this kind of lecture series. For many years, as you mentioned, the Bradley Lectures were a wonderful source of inspiration and provocation here in Washington. I got to attend a lot of the later lectures in that series. I even delivered one of the final Bradley Lectures myself, so maybe the quality of speakers was declining by the end there, Chris. But they were a wonderful way to raise big questions. And that's our hope here, too. Our hope with these lectures is to start some much-needed conversation about the state of the American dream, and to do that in something like a countercultural way, which at this point really means a way that does not begin from the premise that the sky is falling and the future is purely grim and that's all that is left for America are nightmares. That's not really how we think here. We know our country faces very serious challenges, absolutely. But we also know that it brings to bear some very substantial resources for renewal and for strength, and therefore that we have a lot of causes for hope, even as there are a lot of reasons for concern. A lot of our work here is really about realizing that hope, making it real. And in a way, that is what America does at its best. It turns hopes into reality. That's why the metaphor of the American dream is the right way to think about how our country approaches the future. And it's why it's a particular honor for me to be giving the first lecture in this series. The subject I've decided to take up is, for me, very much connected to the American dream, even I would say to my American dream. I am an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Israel. I came here when I was 8 years old, so I grew up here really, but I'm a naturalized citizen. I became an American at the age of 19, and I took the citizenship oath at the federal courthouse in Newark, New Jersey, not the loveliest place in America, by the way, in 1996. It was a huge naturalization ceremony, lots and lots of people from lots of places. And the retired federal judge who officiated, after he gave us the oath, he gave a very short speech. I distinctly remember being disappointed with how short it was. But here I am 25 years or so, more than that later, telling you all about it. I was already by then a kind of history buff and patriotic, and I was hoping he would quote the founders and talk about Lincoln. And he didn't do any of that. He gave a very, very short talk, basically said, from today on, you have to think about America in the first person plural. That was the phrase that he used. You have to say we and us when you talk about America, not them and they. And that was it. That was all he said. It made an impression, I would say. For years after that, I kept with me a little piece of paper that I had from that day. It was the receipt for my green card. So you turn in your green card to get your naturalization certificate, and they give you back a little photocopy of your green card. And on it, I'd written first person plural question mark. And then I wrote we and underlined it twice. And I kept this thing with me for years. I lost it at some point during a move or something. And clearly, I wanted to think about what he had said. What did it really mean? What would it take for us to think and talk about America in terms of we? And I did think about it. I've been thinking about it for a quarter of a century. It's been at the center of all of my work in one way or another for my entire adult life. And that's in part because I've come to think that we is really a terribly important word in the American political tradition. We is the first word of that glorious second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It is the first word of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States. And that's not a coincidence. Both of those documents are expressed in the first person plural because they are both examples of a people taking ownership of its common fate as a nation, acting together politically. The Declaration expresses a common commitment to a set of ideals that underlie a decision, an act of separation undertaken in common. And the Constitution builds on that premise, embraces those principles, but it does something that, in practical terms, might be even more complicated. It establishes a political framework for a society that generally agrees about those fundamental principles, but doesn't agree about very much else, and doesn't even agree about what those principles actually mean as a practical matter. It disagrees about an enormous amount. The Constitution is precisely about how to make that we a reality as a practical matter in the face of an enormous amount of division. And that's what I want to talk about today, how the Constitution can function as a framework for unity and for cohesion, even in a very divided time. As Chris says, that's the subject of my next book, which will be out next year, so that's one natural reason to take it up. But I think it also cuts to the core of what is required now to sustain the American dream, and also of why some Americans seem to be losing hope in the American dream now. We do find it hard to have hope in the future of our society right now because we do seem to be awfully divided. Americans have never lost hope in the face of outside threats, but internal division does strike at the roots of our strength. It leaves us doubtful of our country's capacity to renew itself. In divided times, we tend to equate the sheer multiplicity of American life, just the fact that our society is teeming with different people who have different views, who form different groups, who want different things. We equate that reality with strife, with breakdown, with dysfunction. We assume that multiplicity has to mean disunity. And since we know that our multiplicity, our diversity is a permanent reality, we either rage against reality or we become despondent. Those seem like the two options we have now in American life, rage against reality or become despondent. That's one reason why our politics overflows so much with all that melodramatic despair that you see wherever you turn. We've come to see other Americans as a problem to be solved. And so we've come to imagine that the obstacle to unity in our society is the existence of people who disagree with us. And among other things, that has made us very frustrated with our system of government because that system forces us constantly to deal with people who disagree with us. Too many Americans, therefore, are persuaded that our Constitution is just not well suited to our contemporary circumstances. that it assumes a more unified society than we have now, that it makes it too difficult to adapt to changing times, so that in this divided era, it can only make our problems worse. I want to suggest to you today that that is the opposite of the truth. The Constitution is not the problem we face, it's more like the solution. It was intended exactly to address the problem we have, the challenge of how a divided society can hold together and govern itself. It was designed with an exceptionally sophisticated grasp of the nature of political division and what we would call now diversity. It aims to create common ground in our society, to forge common ground where there isn't any to begin with. It is there in part to unify us. Now, I say in part, that's not all it's for. The Constitution exists to enable American self-government on the terms that are demanded by the Declaration of Independence, in light of the imperatives of order and of justice and of liberty and safety, among others. The preamble nicely summarizes the very ambitious aims that the Constitution has. But the list of those aims in the preamble does begin with the imperative to form a more perfect union. And the modes of governance that the Constitution then creates over and over compel a fractious people to build coalitions, to seek accommodations. The Constitution clearly prizes unity and solidarity. It clearly means to strengthen them. I want to talk about how it means to do that and why it seems not to be working now and what it would take to help that work again. Now, Chris asked me to be brief, and the idea of these lectures is that the actual talk sets up a conversation rather than taking up all the time, and I do want to respect that, so that rather than a kind of academic disquisition on this or even a book talk about a book that isn't really ready for that, let me outline a few propositions that emerge for me from the exploration of this question of the Constitution's approach to unity and to national cohesion, acknowledging that these are not exactly a complete argument, but hoping that they might launch a useful conversation. So I'm going to put to you 5 propositions, all of which now are contested or even unfamiliar to contemporary Americans. And the first one stems from the fact that the Constitution is implicitly rooted in a particular understanding of unity in politics. That understanding emerges from what seems like a contradiction in the thinking of James Madison, the figure among the framers who thought most about division and cohesion. Madison values unity enormously and sees it as an essential purpose of the Constitution. He wasn't alone in that. As I say, for a more perfect union comes first in the preamble. The first third or so of the Federalist Papers are all about the need for union and for unity. But Madison also thinks that unanimity is impossible in a free society on any subject. He says it plainly in Federalist 10, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. So unity not only is possible, but it is essential, and yet a free society is always going to be the scene of intense disagreements. So what then does that make of unity? What does unity actually mean in that situation? This is the first proposition I want to put to you. The Constitution is rooted in the premise that in a free and therefore diverse society, unity does not mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. The difference between thinking alike and acting together can tell us an enormous amount about the kind of unity that the Constitution envisions. That distinct idea of unity is really essential to understanding our Constitution because it's an idea that invites a question to which the Constitution is repeatedly an answer. I say that unity means acting together, not thinking alike, and that forces us to ask, how really practically is that possible? How can we act together when we don't think alike? That is the question to which the Constitution offers itself as an answer. Over and over, all of its modes of action, every one of the institutions that it creates, each of them has its own purposes. They're not only there to answer that question, but each of them also offers an answer to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? A lot of what is mysterious and frustrating to many Americans about our system now is a function of its being an answer to that question, of its being designed to enable people who don't fully agree to nonetheless act together. And how does it do that? It does it very often by leveraging the fundamental challenge of modern liberal democracy, the challenge of empowering majorities while protecting minorities, into a means of forging common ground in a divided society. The Constitution is a democratic document. It assumes that power has to be legitimated by elections. And yet it is also keenly aware that majority rule can be a principle of despotism as much as of legitimation. And so again and again, the Constitution requires majorities to grow before they can be empowered. It never really gives a narrow, ephemeral majority a lot of power to act on its own, as other democratic systems do, including a lot of the European parliamentary democracies. In our system, winning an election gives you a seat at the table, not control of everything that happens. And what happens at the table is bargaining and accommodation and negotiation and competition and various kinds of constructive tension. There are a lot of competing power centers, state and local and federal governments. Within the federal government, you've got 2 houses of Congress, 3 branches of government. Whatever you try to do, there are people in your way. And their power is just as legitimate as yours, and you cannot get anywhere without dealing with people you disagree with, often literally making deals with people you disagree with. That is the core, I think, of the Constitution's answer to the question of how we can act together when we don't think alike. It is by building coalitions of people who come to agreement on how to act together, even when they don't always agree about why. Coalition building is a process of turning multiple minorities into a single majority. It's essential in any representative democracy to some degree, but the American system really stands out for making it unavoidable at every stage of every political process. And crucially, even majorities, unless they are really unusually broad and durable, have to negotiate with minorities before they can act. That is often a source of frustration and of accusations that our system is not sufficiently democratic. But as I said, the Constitution recognizes that majority rule can sometimes be a principle of oppression, not just of legitimacy. So rather than simple majority rule, it looks for something closer to consensus rule through a variety of mechanisms, counter-majoritarian requirements, all kinds of phases and stages that have to be gone through. It frustrates narrow majorities on purpose. And because narrow majorities are the only kind we've had now for a generation, everybody has found American politics very frustrating for a generation. But it is precisely intended to frustrate the kinds of majorities we have now. And this points to the second proposition that I'd put to you. In our system, meaningful policy victory requires broad coalitions, not narrow majorities. You would think that would be obvious. It sort of sounds obvious. But if you watch our politics for 5 minutes right now, you would see that it is not obvious at all. In fact, everybody has forgotten it. Building coalitions through negotiation and competition is now very often taken to be a betrayal of party, a betrayal of your most devoted constituents, a kind of failure of nerve. Politicians naturally promise to fight for their voters, as they should, but too many politicians and too many voters, too, I think, have forgotten that what it means to fight in our system is to bargain effectively, and so to gain advantage by building a broad coalition that advances your priorities. Politicians now behave as though fighting means refusing to negotiate. But in reality, that's what losing looks like. Refusing to negotiate means giving up the only power you have, because what you win when you win an election is a seat at the negotiating table, a part in the discussion about how to act together despite not thinking alike. Refusing to use that power is not a smart way to use that power. The fact that we've forgotten that is a big part of why our practice of constitutionalism is now so out of whack. And in turn, it's a big part of why our politics feel so broken, so divided. It's a problem that is particularly evident in Congress, which is the first and foremost institution of our system exactly because it is the primary venue for bargaining and accommodation at the federal level. Congress is where the fundamental work of acting together when we don't think alike is supposed to happen. That's why it's particularly disturbing to find in Congress the attitude that negotiating with the other side is a betrayal or a failure. I spend a lot of time with members of Congress for my sins, and I should say there are some great ones, there are, but there are too many now who give the impression of not really having a great sense of what the job is supposed to be. They want to be performers in outrage plays. And look, there are a lot of jobs out there now that allow you to be a performer in an outrage play, all kinds of jobs. But a member of Congress is not supposed to be one of those. Members promise their voters that they won't give an inch which really means promising that they won't get an inch. It means promising to fail, and they do fail. We can talk about why that's happened. A lot of my work the last few years is focused on that question, and if you get me started on primaries, you'll regret it. But for the sake of brevity tonight, I want to talk in particular not so much about why it's happened as about what might be done about it. Because I think that is actually a subject that we're very confused about now. And in a way, maybe the first two propositions that I've laid out to you could help alleviate some of that confusion. The purpose of Congress, and here I point you especially to the fantastic recent book on this subject by Phil Wallach, my colleague at AI. The purpose of Congress is to enable Americans to act together when they don't think alike by building coalitions, roughly. It is to enable negotiation and bargaining to address national challenges in broadly acceptable ways. That's not everybody's view of what Congress is for. I'm just giving you my view, which I get from Phil and others. There are people who want Congress to enable whoever won the last election to just adopt their agenda in full and have all the power until the public votes them out. That's not a crazy way to think about democracy. It's not our way, but it's a fairly common way. But I would say it's not our way in large part because it's not a unifying way. In fact, it is a very divisive way to think about democracy because it would dramatically increase the stakes of our elections and therefore the temperature of our politics. The dispute between these two ways of thinking about what Congress is for, to enable accommodations or to advance the majority party's agenda, is very important to grasp because it actually divides a lot of the very people who most want to fix Congress today. There is a lot of agreement now that something is wrong with Congress, and there's even a kind of bipartisan community of congressional reformers in Washington doing important work together. But beneath some of that agreement that Congress is dysfunctional, there's actually a very profound disagreement about just what function it is failing to perform. What's Congress not doing? Most people's answer, I think, would be that it's not passing the legislation that they think is essential, right? So whatever you think is most important, it's not acting on entitlement reform or climate change or whatever is primary for you. That's the common view, but I think it's mistaken. It seems to me that what Congress is failing to do is not so much to advance my policy agenda, but to enable cross-partisan accommodations. What it's failing to do is to enable us to act together when we don't think alike. There's no other institution that is there to allow that to happen in the way that Congress is, and when Congress doesn't do it, it doesn't happen. That difference over diagnosis has enormous implications for prescribing remedies. People who are frustrated with Congress's failure to advance their favored legislation above all, rather than with the failure to somehow advance national cohesion, tend to call for the model of a more narrowly majoritarian kind of European parliament, where the majority party gets to do whatever it wants until it loses its mandate. So they want to eliminate supermajority requirements. They really hate the Senate filibuster. They want to further empower party leaders, further centralize power in both houses. But that is a kind of model that I think is not likely to yield durable legislation in our system now. And more important, it would further undermine the capacity of our politics to engage in common work toward reconcilable goals. Reforms should point in the opposite direction, empowering committees and intra-party factions, not leadership, reinforcing some of the supermajority requirements that are really the only reason why there's now any cross-partisan work in Congress at all. This is the third proposition I'd put to you. Reforms of Congress should make cross-partisan bargaining more likely rather than making it less necessary. That kind of approach to the problems with our institutions of government, asking what's the purpose of the institution and therefore what is it that it's now failing to do, should also inform how we think about the presidency now, because I think we're almost as confused about the presidency as we are about Congress. Like our sense of Congress's purpose, our understanding of the executive is dominated by a kind of prioritization of policy action over the Madisonian prioritization of political order and social cohesion. In fact, we think about the presidency now in very legislative terms. We think that it is a representative institution and that its purpose is to advance the policy agenda of the party that won the last election. But the presidency is a unitary office. It can't be representative of a diverse society. And it's an administrative office. Its purpose is a different kind of action than legislative action. Certainly, the president is intended to have a role in driving the agenda of our politics, in putting some key questions on the table, setting some priorities. But the kind of bargaining and accommodation through which policy is supposed to be made cannot happen within the office of the American president. And that means that the president can't advance unity in particular by assertive policy action. The distinct role that the president has in advancing national cohesion, along with the other roles he has, his particular role in advancing unity has to do not so much with energetic policy advocacy, but with what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration. Here, the most important voice to listen to is another AI colleague of ours, Adam White. If I know anything about this that I didn't learn from Adam, it's probably wrong. As he's been showing for years, energy obviously is an important facet of the president's role, but we pay plenty of attention to that. What we neglect now is the imperative for steadiness. Stability, steadiness is essential to social peace. As Madison argues in Fairley 62, precarious, changeable administration makes it very difficult for people to feel secure, to make plans, to take risks, to engage with each other across lines of difference. Unsteadiness in government makes it very hard for anybody to be a faithful, law-abiding citizen. And steadiness in administration depends especially on the president, because the president puts our legal frameworks into effect. When every president spends half of his time undoing his predecessor's administrative actions, and then the other half taking actions that he knows his successor will undo, we lose the steadiness that is essential to a free society. Contemporary presidents, because they value their ability to drive policy action that way, essentially do the work of the legislature that legislators won't do. They have dramatically underemphasized steady administration. And the effect of that has not just been bad for administration, though it has been. It's also been very bad for national cohesion. It again dramatically raises the stakes of our elections, the temperature of our politics, because it means that key questions don't get resolved by bargaining and coalition building, but by sharp turns and hard stops. Everything depends on who the president is. And so my fourth proposition to you, the fourth kind of implication of looking at the Constitution through the lens of national unity, is that the work of the executive now should prioritize steady administration more than assertive policymaking. When it comes to the third branch, to the courts, I don't think that an agenda of reform is really quite the way to think about what's needed. The courts obviously have a crucial part to play in advancing unity too, but it may not be quite the part that we imagine. I think it's not fundamentally rooted in their ability to resolve disputes. Courts do resolve disputes, obviously, that's what they do. But they're intended to resolve disputes over what the law is, not what it should be. And so they're not quite the venue for mediating among competing visions of the public good. Our great public disputes ought to be resolved through the work of the legislature above all. The most valuable service that the courts can provide on that front, on the front of national unity, alongside, again, their other crucial purposes, is therefore in their policing of the rules and boundaries of constitutionalism, their restricting of the power of majorities and of public officials to pursue various kinds of end runs around the structure of the system. Now, I would say the courts have actually been improving on this front, and unlike the elected branches, they're now, I would say, closer to serving their proper constitutional purpose than they were a generation ago. They do need more of a focus, I think, on constitutional structure rather than on the policing of personal rights. But the transformation of the courts in this century has been pretty extraordinary and for the good. So when it comes to the courts, the fifth and final proposition that I'd offer to you is really a function of that very transformation. It is that the lesson of conservative success in the courts is that we should fight for the Constitution and not against it. Conservatives, constitutionalists, had every reason to give up on the judiciary in the second half of the 20th century. But rather than give up on it, they set about renewing its commitment to its own proper purposes through a project that began as intellectual work, much of it here at AI, and then evolved into institutional work at the Federalist Society and elsewhere, supported by political work that enabled a genuine transformation of the judiciary. It was, from the beginning, a kind of labor of love of the Constitution, love of the country. And that is exactly how we should think about the constitutional challenges that we face now. We are, I think, especially with regard to Congress in particular, we are roughly where the right was regarding the courts in the middle of the 1970s. The idea that we could reform Congress to do its job again seems hopelessly naive right now, if you look around. But it is not more naive than the notion that Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork and Lawrence Silberman had when they were AI scholars 50 years ago, that you could have originalist judges dominating the judiciary. I think there's a certain kind of strategic naivete that is actually very crucial to successful reform efforts. You have to be a little naive about what you love most in the world. You're not a cold-eyed realist about your spouse or the New York Mets. You have to be just a little bit naive about our country, too, about its prospects. Not so naive that it makes you optimistic. That's silly. But just naive enough to be hopeful. And so to fight for our Constitution and not against it. There are a lot of people now, including a lot of people on the right, who are ready to give up on the Constitution or to dismiss it as inadequate to a society that is as divided as ours is. But those people are exactly wrong. The Constitution was intended precisely to address the problem that we now face, the challenge of governing ourselves despite deep divisions, and in a way that can heal those divisions just a little, that can bring us together and help us understand ourselves as one society engaged in common work despite a diversity of beliefs and desires and interests that is not going away. Helping the Constitution to do that requires understanding how it was intended to do that and transforming that understanding into a kind of agenda for reform and action. And that's what I've tried to sketch out very broadly with these propositions. So let me close by just listing for you one more time these 5 ideas and suggesting that maybe they add up to a kind of agenda for friends of the Constitution now. They are that unity means acting together and not thinking alike, that policy victory requires broad coalitions, not narrow majorities, that reforms of Congress should make cross-partisan bargaining more likely, not less necessary, that the work of the executive should prioritize steady administration, not assertive policymaking, and that the lesson of success in the courts is that we should fight for the Constitution and not against it. These are broad propositions, obviously, and we can talk a little bit about what each of them might point to in more specific terms of action. But I think it's crucial to see that each of these opposes itself to an appealing and familiar kind of mistake, a mistake that I've put after the not in the way that I've tried to present these 5 ideas. And the combination of those mistakes sketches something like the rival constitutional vision that we on the right always find ourselves contending with, the progressive or Wilsonian alternative to Madison's constitutionalism. That rival vision looks for a unity of thinking alike more than just acting together. It's exceptionally intolerant of dissent. It wants to prioritize assertive policy action over the broadening of coalitions. It wants to make cross-partisan bargaining in Congress less necessary, not more likely. It wants the president to act on his own more, to drive policymaking. And ultimately, it sees the Constitution as standing in its way more than showing a way forward. Conservatives have been fighting against that Wilsonian vision for a long time now, but maybe we've been fighting against it for so long that we have been forgetting what we're fighting for. And we've adopted a kind of right-leaning Wilsonianism rather than really recurring to Madison's vision of the Constitution. The price of our forgetfulness on that front is not just a deformed constitutional order, it's also a more divided society. And that is really crucial to see now. The reason to recover Madison's vision some is not just to be more faithful to our tradition in the abstract, it's also to actually address the most difficult and dangerous problems that our society faces now, to be more unified amid our diversity, to better act together even when we don't think alike, and so to recover some of our faith in our country and our confidence in the American dream. Thank you very much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Yuval. So I'm going to pepper him with gotcha questions for the next 15 to 20 minutes before turning it over to audience Q&A. Yuval, let me start with the executive branch and something you wrote for Law and Liberty about the presidency recently. And I imagine something like this will appear in your book. You wrote, "The sorts of changes most needed are forms of restraint and self-conscious circumspection by our presidents
This is where that naivete comes in.
I was going to say,
Yes.
rooted in an understanding of what the chief executive has to offer, the cause of greater unity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that seems pretty nice. Let's say very, very hopeful. How does that happen? How do we find the new Calvin Coolidge?
Yeah.
It seems like, when you're talking about the courts, obviously I like the comparison you're making there, but the obstacles are different and the people you have to persuade along the way are different. How do you persuade presidential candidates during primaries that this is a winning argument?
So I think the obstacles are somewhat different, although persuading judges to be less powerful was also not obviously doable. So that I think there is something of a model for us in general in how that project went, which was, I would say, to create a set of expectations that came to be implicit, that came to be understood as people's sense of what's required of the office. The presidency is different. Our presidents have always been very ambitious. I would say that the nature of the office is such that it takes an almost insanely ambitious person to think they could do that job.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that we have some insanely ambitious people who think they can do it, because somebody does need to do that job. I worked for a president for 4 years, and I would say it's an awful job. I mean, you just have to be crazy to want to do that job, to wake up and read the news every morning, and everything you see on the front page is your problem that day. You got to be nuts to want to do it. And part of what appeals to people is ambition, right? They want to put themselves in the center of the story. And I don't think that's a bad thing. That's part of what we need from our presidents. But the question is, what does it mean to be at the center of the story? And I think some of what our presidents have to see is that they would be stronger if they acknowledged some of their limitations, that they would be in a better place to do their job effectively, to be seen as successful, if they did not take it upon themselves to also do the job of Congress. There's great power in saying, look, I too want to fix immigration, but these people have to do it. Harry Truman understood that. He wasn't Calvin Coolidge. He was a very different kind of president. But the sense that Congress has a job, and it's only by their doing that job that the president can be enabled to do his job, at least when it comes to domestic affairs. I think it is incumbent upon presidents to rediscover that. There is real power in that. And, most of what has to be done to correct some of the imbalances in the administrative state and in the way our executive branch works now actually also has to be done in Congress. The president can't do most of that himself. A lot of presidential overreach, like a lot of judicial overreach, is a function of congressional underreach, which is intentional and willful and is the biggest problem in our system now. We have to focus on fixing Congress more than anything else at the moment. But I do think that some different expectations of the job on the part of the president as well as of voters and the people around the president are achievable if we help people see that for the system to work, everybody involved has to do their job. It can't just be that the president will say, Congress didn't do this, so I'm going to do this. Yeah. That is not how our system is designed to work, and it's not how presidents can really be powerful.
You just mentioned the administrative state. In one of your recent pieces, you refer to the administrative state as a parliament of lawyers, which has echoes of a P.G. O'Rourke book. Actually, it's maybe even a more vulgar title than that.
I meant that, but
To put it simply, what is the proper role of the administrative state? What should it? What jobs should the administrative state actually have? I mean, there's especially an agreement among conservatives that it's way too big, but how would you describe what it really should be doing?
I think that our thinking about this on the right is a little bit like where our judicial thinking was until the last few years, when suddenly we have a majority on the court and we have to think about actually governing. So we know what we're against. We're against whatever it is we're calling the administrative state, and I'm against that too. But there is a need for administration in modern government, and there are ways in which modern government, because of the complexity of modern life and of the economy, does have to call upon expertise in some very complicated ways. I think that where where we move from describing regulation and administration to talking about the administrative state has to do with modes of action. I would say the administrative state involves legislative action without legislative forms. And in some cases, even judicial action without judicial forms. Forms are very important in the constitutional system. A lot of what the Constitution is a set of forms, of ways of doing things. And legislative forms are there to make sure that the construction of frameworks for law in our society takes place through a representative and deliberative process. That people elected by the public, who in some way represent the interests of their constituents, bargain together toward legal frameworks. When laws are made outside of that process, those laws don't have the same legitimacy. And there are ways in which regulatory administrative agencies try to be representative. They try to get public comment, or there is a kind of negotiation among interest groups, but they don't really have any of the forms that make legislative work a legitimate way to make law. And when you make law in illegitimate ways, you end up with illegitimate law. And I think a fair amount of administrative law as it now stands, frankly, answers to that description. Now, the trouble is, again, what's required to fix that is first and foremost Congress doing its job.
Yeah.
A lot of the reason why the agencies step in the way they do, not the only reason, but a lot of the reason, is that Congress prefers to legislate in vague ways and then to stand by and watch what happens and complain. And no one can make Congress do its job. That's a huge part of the problem we face now, is nothing's really required of Congress. Congress has a lot of powers. It has really no duties in the way that a president does and judges do. Congress has to want to do its job. And I think the assumption was that the ambition of members would drive them to want to do their jobs. And we're in a moment now where the ambition of members is directed in a different direction, is channeled in a different way than doing their traditional legislative work. So that, again, to think about how to fix the administrative state, you have to think about Congress. I am very wary of solutions to that problem that are court-centered. The idea that the court's going to say that from now on Congress has to do its job, or that you can't delegate anymore, I'm not really sure what's supposed to happen the day after that. And again, we have to think in terms of how to actually govern, how to actually use power, not just what we don't like. And so for Congress to be ready to take on the kinds of obligations that are required of it in our system, members have to change their attitude about what they're up to. And I think the core of the solution to the problem we describe as the administrative state has to come from Congress first and foremost.
What do you think most representatives and senators think that they're actually up to? Is it just kind of performative outrage? Is that the center of their ambition?
Well, so, I've spent like 5 years now accusing them of that, and so I kind of get to hear what they think about it. I don't...
They're outraged.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I would say nobody explicitly thinks that's what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
But it does seem to me that a lot of members have a sense that what it means to represent their constituents is to articulate the anger that their constituents bring to politics, to say it and to let it be heard. And so they do have a fundamentally expressive notion of what their job is, and they see Congress as a particularly prominent platform for expression. And it's a pretty good place to get, a slot on cable news. But they are less familiar, and I put it that way because I think in some ways that's actually the deepest source of the problem now. They're less familiar with the nature of legislative work. Fewer members come from state legislatures, and very few members have been there long enough to actually have seen Congress operate in a different way than this. So that I'm not that old, but I find myself speaking to congressional staff. I'll tell you why I said that. A few months ago, I gave a little lunch talk to the Republican staff of the House Budget Committee. And I used to work on the House Budget Committee at the end of the 1990s when John Kasich was chairman. And I told him in passing that Kasich and the ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, who happened to also be from Ohio then, would have dinner together at this horrible little Italian restaurant every Wednesday, every week.
The AV Club? Was it the AV?
I don't remember the name, and I didn't remember it then. But
sorry,
they both complained about it every Thursday. They were both there. And I didn't think that this was the point of my story, but they sort of stopped me and said, "What? They had dinner together every week?"
Yeah.
And they were not alone in doing that. The idea that a chairman and ranking member of a prominent committee would do that was how a lot of Congress still worked, even in the 90s, which, let me tell you, the 90s were not a golden age for Congress. It's not as if there was not intense division. There was. But a lot of members now have not experienced even that kind of Congress. And their sense of what the job is shaped by the last few years, because that's as long as they've been there, especially in the House. So that I think that the notion that their job is to participate in a very frustrating negotiating process, and then at the end of the day to go home and to crow to their constituents about the little bit they got for the district, they just don't think about their job that way.
Yeah.
And that means that when they try to measure their success, when they try to find ways to channel their ambition into their work, what they're really talking about is a kind of prominence gained by not doing their job. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a process of education that is required for members and staff that's in some ways, again, a little bit like teaching a generation of judges what a judge does. It has to start early, and it has to start now. And ultimately, they have to be persuaded of it, because only Congress can fix Congress.
Yeah. I will ask maybe one or two more questions before turning it over to you all. So if you want to ask any questions, take notes. You have a couple minutes left to do that before I turn it over. Any questions about Yuval's talk or Italian restaurants in D.C.? All right. You obviously focus on the role of the three branches of government, which makes sense in a discussion of the Constitution as a source of unity. But also over the course of your career, you've paid a lot of attention to the Burkean little platoons versus civic institutions like family, churches, local organizations. Where do they fit into this argument, or do they? What role can they play in kind of buttressing the unity promised by the Constitution? Yeah. And does the Constitution indirectly offer lessons to them about how those institutions can help here?
Yeah, it's a really nice question. I would say I came to this subject in a way by way of a mirror image of that question, which is having worked a lot on those subjects, on civil society and on the kind of the nature of federalism and other things. I found myself confronted with the question, well, what about politics? What about actually the institutions of the system? Don't they have a part to play in addressing the kinds of division we have? And in a way, this effort is a way it's complementary to those arguments, it's not meant to be a substitute for them, because I think these things have to work together. Ultimately, what we're talking about is forming citizens who are good at living in a diverse society. And that's very hard. An American citizen is a social achievement, not some kind of natural phenomena. They don't just fall from the sky. They have to be created by a variety of formative institutions that shape people to be very, very good at the extremely complicated task of handling a lot of freedom really well. The fact that there are millions of people in this country who can do that, who can just be left alone to pursue their own interests and do it in a way that doesn't involve killing people, that's really impressive. It's an achievement. And I think it's an achievement of our constitutional system. In part, the Constitution does shape us as citizens. It's also, more so, an achievement of our more near-at-hand formative institutions, which in a lot of ways, from family and school and church and community, shape us also to learn how to deal with people we disagree with and to learn how to act together when we don't think alike. I do think that kind of formative work, what we call civic education now, there's suddenly a lot of interest in the abstract in civic education. But I think we do have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose? What are we being educated to do? And I think there too, understanding unity as consisting of acting together more than thinking alike is an important part of seeing what civic education is for. It's for teaching us how to act together when we don't think alike. That requires history, that requires knowledge of the system. It also requires experience in the work of citizenship. Now, I should say, I don't want to simply stress the acting together. There is some thinking alike in American life. There are things we agree on. There are very important things we agree on. And I do think that the core principles of the Declaration of Independence are actually very broadly shared in American life. It's just that we don't agree about exactly what they mean in a lot of practical situations. People who are very far from me in politics, who are very far on the left, they believe in equality. They believe we're all created equal. I don't doubt that for a second. We disagree about exactly what that amounts to when it comes to thinking about public policy and political life and culture and education. But we're disagreeing about what the principles we share mean. And that kind of shared foundation and then disagreement about practical action, that's the nature of a free society. I think that's not just a modern political teaching. That's if you think about the kind of Aristotelian idea of civic friendship, that's what it's all about. There is a common sense of what virtue entails, but there are profound practical disagreements. And civic friendship is how we deal with those. And it took me 50 minutes to get to Aristotle. So
I was going to say, so we have Aristotle,
well done.
We got Burke, we still have not heard from Tocqueville, but there's time left, so make it an official AEI event. All right, let's turn it over to you all for questions. I'm in charge of calling on people. When I do, please wait for the microphone to reach you, state your name, and ask a question. Gentleman there in the center of the table in the colorful tie.
I'm David Epstein.
Yeah. A great scholar of the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. In your admirable focus on what should be done, you quickly skipped over the question of why this happened and what went wrong, and I wondered if you had a fuller historical theory that, I mean, if the Constitution was intended to constrain the actors so as to require them to build coalitions, why doesn't that requirement actually shape their behavior, or at what point did it stop shaping their behavior?
Yeah, thank you very much. I certainly devote a lot of attention to that question in the book and have in prior writing too, because I think it is crucial to understand the sources of the challenges we face if we're going to think about solutions. I would say, broadly speaking, that I think there has been in the American political tradition a rival strand of constitutional thought for a long time that has actively rejected the Madisonian conception of unity. That has seen it as a mistake and made an argument for why it should be seen as a mistake. I think of it particularly as a kind of post-Civil War strand, and maybe just as a progressive strand. You can find it in Woodrow Wilson's political science from very early on. It's a powerful argument, and I think it's an argument that has to be contended with. At some level, I would say maybe at the deepest level, it is actually an argument against the notion that it is possible to act together when you don't think alike. Wilson has a kind of, I would use the term integralism without calling on too much of its contemporary significance. Wilson says at one point that the Madisonian system has a Newtonian conception of itself, that it thinks of politics as a machine with parts that have to act against one another to sustain a balance, but that it would be better to have a Darwinian conception instead, that we should see politics and government in organic terms, and that a living being can't have its organs pulling in different directions. That would kill it. They all have to be operating in the same direction in accordance with the same vision, answering to the same mind. And he wanted a politics that worked more like that, and therefore that was answerable to cohesive, unified leadership which, if you think about it that way, naturally belongs in the hands of the president. he still believed in democracy, but he thought about it in a different way. He thought of an election as providing the president in particular and his party with a mandate for action for as long as they had the majority, and that everything should answer to them, to that mandate. That argument is not crazy, but I think that it's an argument that presents itself as more sophisticated about what it takes to govern a complicated modern society, but it is actually much less sophisticated than Madison is about the most important challenge of modern politics, which is the challenge of division and faction and diversity. Madison is much more sophisticated than Woodrow Wilson about that question. He's more sophisticated than anybody in our political tradition, in my view, on that question. And the sense he has that you can contend with division through coalition building is absolutely essential to understanding the logic of our system. Woodrow Wilson just disagreed with that. I think he flatly disagreed that that was necessary. He didn't think that division was as big a problem for a society like ours as Madison did. And he advanced a set of ideas that points in a direction of a more confrontational and more divided politics. The progressivism that followed from that made that argument pretty explicit. I mean, by the middle of the 20th century, we have Daniel Stitt here, who's a great scholar of this question. By the middle of the 20th century, progressive political scientists were arguing that there was not enough disagreement in American politics and that we needed a politics that was much more intensely divided so that our parties could be responsible, that's also Wilson's phrase, and that people would have a real choice at election time and not just face these two kind of messy, meaningless blobs of the two parties, but actually face a choice. Again, it's not a crazy argument, but I think that ultimately it is an argument for a much more divisive politics, a much less constrained politics, and much less focused on coalition building. And I guess I would say here we are.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
You hinted at this during your opening remarks, that you think that there's a conservative strain that's kind of moving in that same direction. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, there is a conservative version of a kind of political integralism now. In some ways, there always has been. I think there's always some resistance to the notion that that deep disagreement is unavoidable in a free society. There's always a desire to pursue a politics that allows for much more deep and fundamental agreement than that. But I also think that there is a kind of that there is now some conservative despondency about the prospects for recovering the Constitution. And there's a sense that if the left is succeeding by just taking power, then the right has to just take power. Mm-hmm. And that what's wrong with the left is that it's using these means for ends we disagree with, rather than that it's using these means. Mm-hmm. I think they're mistaken about that. I think there is not a legitimate way to deploy the kinds of means that that they have in mind. I don't think there is. I don't think that there is a good kind of conservative Wilsonianism, because I don't think it can ultimately work in a way that sustains the preconditions for a free society, as I understand it. And so I think conservatives, as I said, have to fight for the Constitution and not against it. But there are some conservatives who are tired of fighting for the Constitution. Yeah. And, you know, some of them teach in the top law school in the United States.
Better move on to another question. Yes, right here.
Hey, Yuval, John Ward, Yahoo News. You were talking about, you know, being where we are now, comparing it to the 70s and the judiciary. Thinking about the task of reforming Congress, when you compare that to the judiciary, the Federalist Society is one of the big mechanisms that was a part of that. What would an effort to reform Congress look like? What would a institution look like towards that goal? And would it need to be ideologically, you know, to the right, as the Federalist Society has been, or would it actually need to be more to the center?
Yeah, It's a great question, John, and I don't have an easy answer. The Federalist Society, in retrospect, had the tremendous advantage of access to a profession. And so they were able to provide prospective lawyers with genuine professional advantages in return for their being willing to be formed in a particular vision of the Constitution. You could really get a clerkship working for a real Supreme Court justice and then get a really good job after that too, if you were part of this process. There's obviously not a similar kind of profession at work here, other than politicians, to leverage the incentives that politicians confront is a very complicated challenge. I think it is part of what would have to be done. I think that we do have to think concretely about some of the incentives that politicians face. Some of those incentives are part of the problem. I think fixing Congress, for example, would require some reforms of the primary system. And by the way, that's not because I think primaries created the problem in Congress. I actually don't think that's quite right. There have been primaries for congressional offices for 100 years in most of the country. But, you know, prescription is not diagnosis in reverse. You don't solve problems by undoing what caused them. You have to think about how to change circumstances from where you are. And from where we are now, I do think that you absolutely have to think about electoral incentives, and the most powerful of those now are in the party primaries. You have to think in general about how to empower the parties as institutions again, because the weaker the parties get, the stronger partisanship gets. And you know, the parties actually are moderating institutions. Their incentive is to build a broad coalition. And so they don't want to pick crazy people to carry their banner. It's when they lose control that you end up with people who are very unattractive to the median voter. But I also think you have to just, you know, in a way, we try to be pretty simple-minded about this at AI. We just go to them and talk to them about how their lives could be better if Congress was less awful. A lot of members of Congress really don't like their jobs right now. It's very hard to find a member, really, not impossible, but it's very hard to find a member who will say, this job is great. This every day is fantastic. They do not think that. And you know, that's a place to start, because a lot of what bothers them about their work are things they can change. And that's in some ways a primary obstacle for us, is that they don't think in terms of changing the institution. You talk to a lot of members who say the budget process is totally nuts. Why do we do this? And you want to say, well, yeah, why do you do it? You could just not do it. It's really up to you. The budget process is not holy writ. It's not in the Constitution even. It was just created in the mid-'70s for a Democratic House to serve its own purposes. Well, do it differently. I think a lot of that kind of thinking is now absent because members have really only known one particular way of thinking about Congress. And beginning from their own dissatisfaction and helping them to ask some questions about how the institution could be different, how they could channel their ambition in ways that they would also feel good about and not sort of have to take 3 showers a day to get through the day. That's not impossible because they are human beings. And so I think there's a lot of, when thinking about Congress, there's a lot of kind of, oh, they're never going to do that. And I don't know, they might do it. They're unhappy men and women. So that's kind of where reform starts. And our job, you know, my job is just to put Phil in front of them, to tell them how this could be better. And, you know, if you know one, tell me, and I'll put Phil in front of them. That's kind of what we do here.
Yes, in the back.
Sorry. Hello. You spoke extensively about kind of this idea of like durable legislation and the importance of congressional consensus. The kind that it seems like is the type to take place over years or decades. I was curious how you think that general principle applies to policy issues that are legitimately time sensitive and require a rapid response from Congress.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are a couple of different sorts of categories of those kinds of issues. There are real emergencies, things that really require immediate action. And I would actually say, and here I learned from Phil Wallach too, that Congress, the modern Congress, is actually pretty good at dealing with emergencies, real emergencies like COVID. Believe it or not, Congress actually did a better job than any legislature in the West in dealing with COVID. They sort of got a sense from two different presidents of what was needed, and they did it. And they spent a huge amount of money very quickly. I'm sure a lot of it was wasted. It was a terrible idea, but it was what seemed necessary in the moment, and they came together and did it. I would say that they have responded that way to particularly dramatic economic crises in the 21st century, too. Crisis legislation actually does kind of happen in Congress. Or think about Congress after 9/11. It was really pretty impressive there for a while. Then there's another set of issues that I would describe as kind of medium-term issues. We really have to do something about the trajectory of entitlement spending. I mean, we really do. But Congress is very bad at dealing with that kind of issue. I think that's true around climate. I think it's true around the kinds of things that if you let them go on forever, they really could be really bad, but they're not going to be really bad at the next election. And that means that's a blind spot for Congress that the modern Congress really is quite bad at dealing with. That's not new. I mean, nobody really wants to deal with a big problem they don't have to deal with. But I do think that it's a place where the reticence to bargain becomes a particularly big problem. Congress does legislate some across party lines. I would say that at this point, that happens almost entirely because of the Senate filibuster. I'm a huge fan of the Senate filibuster. I think that the tendency of every tiny little Senate majority to say, okay, now we got to get rid of the filibuster, is a terribly destructive inclination. If you think about the last Congress, I don't know about this Congress, it's not really doing anything at all, but the last Congress, Democrats came in with majorities, and they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to change the election laws in all 50 states after we had just had an election where a lot of people didn't have confidence in the system. They were going to do it on their own in a way that every Democrat agreed with and 0 Republicans agreed with. It was absolutely insane, an unbelievable kind of civic vandalism. And the only reason that it did not happen is the Senate filibuster. And at the same time, the things they did do, like the CHIPS Act or the infrastructure bill, reforming the Electoral Count Act, genuinely bipartisan legislation that will endure because it was bipartisan, also only happened because of the Senate filibuster. So that in both respects, you might say Congress only did its job in a recognizably constitution-minded way because of the filibuster. And I think it is very important to retain those kinds of guards against ephemeral, narrow majority action. And you know that's not a solution to the fiscal problem. That's not a solution to these kinds of things that everybody sees coming down the road for 20 years and we never act on. But I do think that it's at least how we have to think about starting on a path to a Congress that thinks about its job in terms of bargaining and accommodation. And you know, ultimately, that's how you can have any hope of getting to a place where those bigger problems get dealt with. But is Congress going to deal with them short of an emergency? Like I say, I'm not optimistic. I'm just hopeful. So I don't see it at the moment.
Time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Gary. Gary, yeah.
So one of the most interesting things about the Madisonian Constitution is how quickly political parties arose. And so then the question is, and particularly Madison himself was part of that process. So is there something inherent in the Madisonian Constitution that lends itself and or is failing that the need for parties arise?
Yeah, I really do think so. There'll be a chapter in this book on that question too. I think of the party system. I think of party politics as a weird kind of blind spot in the otherwise really extraordinary political vision of the framers. There was a real sense in their rhetoric and in their action that suggested that they believed, at least in the course of fashioning the Constitution, that you could have a functional political system without political parties. I think in part they were living in a moment where there was a kind of pocket of cross-partisan consensus in American life for a little while. You know, the agreement around the revolution, which obviously was a divisive issue in American life, crossed the usual kind of left-right divide, the left-right divide of English politics, say, between the Whigs and the Tories, just wasn't present in America for a little while. And you have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence together. Like it was a weird moment. And I think it left them believing that it might be possible to avoid a partisan politics. And Madison early on equates party and faction in a way that I think he later changes his mind about. In the sense that a faction is a group in politics that is in politics to pursue its own interest to the detriment of the larger society. Whereas a party is a group that is unified around a shared view of the common good. Parties disagree about what would be good for everybody. They're not in politics just for their own good. That kind of party emerges very quickly as necessary in a sense. I think there were some particular reasons for it. The design of the Electoral College, which is really bizarre in a lot of ways, created a need for parties fairly quickly because the Electoral College just never worked the way it was meant to work. It was meant to be a kind of deliberative process between the people and the choice of the president, and very quickly it just became a kind of rubber stamp on votes in the states. And there was no deliberative process about the choice of the president. And that process ended up happening in the parties instead. I would say that happened early, but it also happened especially, so you have the rise of the Democrats with Madison and Jefferson, but by the end of the era of good feeling, there's only one party. The 1824 election, you have 4 candidates, and they're all Democrats. That election was a disaster and ended up in the House. And you have, a small group of Democrats, especially Martin Van Buren, who thought, well, this is going to happen every time unless we have some process for filtering who runs for president. And a lot of what was intended to happen in the Electoral College ends up happening between parties in our system. The parties are created so that there are only 2 candidates for president, because otherwise every election will go to the House of Representatives. I think Van Buren and others also saw that the parties could condition people to think coalitionally before they ran for office, so that they could then think coalitionally in office. And the party system was a very good fit for the Madisonian system. And I think it is that. I think the American 2-party system is a very good fit for the kind of coalitional politics that the Constitution requires. It creates these 2 parties that are not like European parties. They're massive, really sloppy kind of coalitions. And they have to internally work to broaden themselves to become a majority if they're going to win an election. And that's really exactly how we should think if we're going to populate institutions like the Congress and the presidency and the state legislatures. So yeah, I think our system needed parties, and it took a while to get them, but I think of them as part of the constitutional system in a way.
Time for one more question in the back table there.
Thank you so much. Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Institute for Academic Management. My question pertains to, as a fellow immigrant and someone who holds dear the concrete construction of the Constitution, and coming from the UK, I'm curious to find out how many, in your mind, how many or why so few Americans actually know the Constitution, and is that intentional, that they don't know the contents of the Constitution, and which is why they don't uphold it per se, or is it just diluted?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that is hard to answer because we live with a kind of sense that it used to be very different. I think a lot of the conversation that is had around civic education now is built on the premise that it used to be the case that Americans just kind of knew, lots about the Constitution. I don't really think that's true. It certainly used to be the case that fewer people were allowed to be involved in politics, and that's not good. So sure, more of the people who were involved probably had more of an educated understanding of the system, but I don't think that's what we're trying to do. You know, the notion that Americans used to be much better informed about constitutional principles probably isn't quite right, although I don't know, and I don't think it would be easy to know. It is a problem. I think Americans ought to be more informed about the Constitution. I don't think that it's really possible to get to a place where everybody walks around with a huge amount of knowledge about constitutional law. I'm not sure I would really like that country all that much, really, but in any case, that's not what we're going to be. But I think Americans have to have a sense, and this really gets back to where I started in the talk, have to have a sense of ownership of the American Republic, a way of thinking about our country in that way, in that sense of first-person plural. Well, this is our problem, and when things go wrong, you don't just fold your arms and wait for somebody to show up and fix it, but sort of take ownership of it yourself. There's, you know, the word responsibility is a wonderfully American political kind of word. It used to be that the Oxford English Dictionary said the first use of it was in Madison's notes on the Constitution. They actually don't say that anymore. I wish they did. It would be very useful to me. They have found earlier uses, and in Britain. But one of the earliest uses was really to describe the American presidency. And I think it's also the case that responsibility is a word that describes our relation to politics in a distinct way in the United States. It's ours. We own it. We're accountable for it. And it would help if more Americans thought of politics that way. I don't know how deep we can get into constitutional knowledge, but that sense, that instinct, is something we should work for.
Thank you, Yuval. Join me in giving him a round of applause. And thank you all for attending this evening. I'm very grateful. I'm so grateful, in fact, that I'm treating you all to a reception right after this. Before you go, though, I want to remind you that we have some other events for this lecture series already scheduled. On November 16th here, we'll have Caitlin Flanagan in conversation with Thomas Chatterton Williams about free speech. On January 25th, we have Gary Saul Morson of Northwestern University in conversation with one of his former students, our own Tony Mills, about Russian literature. Jonathan Haidt will be here in April. We don't know the precise date yet, to discuss social media and literature, and democracy. Maybe we'll talk about books too. And then we are shooting for another event in May, TBA. So I hope to see you at some of those events as well. Thank you very much. Great job, Yuval. Thank you.